Did everyone get an examination book as they came in? Will it be a test? Well, what I'd like to do over the next about 15 minutes roughly is give you a quick overview of my most recent book, The End of Growth. The thesis, of course, is that economic growth as we've known it is in the process of coming to an end. And that's a controversial and sort of startling claim. First of all, what economic growth are we really talking about here? Well, it's GDP growth, gross domestic product, which is in most respects an indicator of consumption. So as you can see, GDP per capita didn't change much over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, even though empires were rising and falling. But just in the last couple of hundred years, we've really seen enormous amounts of GDP growth. And I think we've all been talked into the idea that this is sort of normal and it can go on forever. But I think it's important to, first of all, to contextualize the economic growth that we've been seeing as a pretty recent phenomenon. Now, if you really think about it, nothing grows forever on a finite planet. I mean, maybe the universe will continue to expand forever. That's possible. Even that is controversial. But on a finite planet like ours, think of a newborn hamster. Grows very fast for the first part of its life. Its body weight is actually doubling every week for the first few weeks of its life. Now, little thought experiment. What would happen if our little hamster were to continue doubling its body weight every week for one whole year? 52 doublings. How big a hamster would we have? Would it be a 50-pound hamster? 500-pound hamster? Actually, it would be a 9 billion-ton hamster. It's never happened, never will happen. That's the kind of absurdity that arises from unending compounded growth, which is what we're assuming will continue for our economy. Now, of course, in the last couple of hundred years, we've also seen increased population going from a little under 1,800,000,000 to just over 7 billion today. That's an extraordinary rate of increase. Obviously, that can't go on forever. But, okay, this is per capita GDP. Multiply that by the increase in the number of capitas, and it's really extraordinary how much wealth we've created in a very short period of time. How has this happened? What enabled this to take place? Well, interestingly, our energy consumption has also grown dramatically over this short period of time. And I would suggest there's a definite relationship, because energy is not just part of the economy. Energy really is the economy. Energy is what enables us to do stuff. Anything we do takes energy. And so having lots of inexpensive, portable, concentrated energy could allow us to do a lot of things. And it has. As you can see, the renewable energy in the U.S. or in the world economy today is about the same quantity of energy as we were using in 1830. The big increase has been in fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Solar energy is, for all practical purposes, limitless on planet Earth, but our ability to gather it and use it has been limited in the past and still is to a very large extent. So when we gained access to fossil fuels, which were created by natural processes acting over tens of millions of years, processes into which we had to invest no effort whatsoever, when we gained access to those fuels, we found nature's biggest treasure chest. Now, again, economic growth in principle can't go on forever. So when are we likely to start having problems maintaining economic growth? Well, the answer to that question was first proposed back in 1972 as a result of the work of a team of MIT scientists, published in this book, Limits to Growth, which went on to become the best-selling environmental book of all time. In 1972, I was 21 years old. I read this book, and it's really shaped my outlook on life ever since. I think young people are having the same experience today as when they first learned about climate change. This is the first time I realized that our society was on an unsustainable path. And when I say unsustainable, I don't mean not sufficiently eco-groovy. I mean a path that can't go on much longer. What they did with this study was to look at the interaction between a few basic trends, population growth, resource depletion, and environmental impacts of industrial processes. Three important ones. There were others as well, agricultural production. So their standard run scenario showed a peak and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. Now, of course, this was a startling and unwelcome outcome, so what they did was to go back to their input data and double Earth's resources and program in governmental policies to reduce the rate of population growth or to reduce environmental pollution and so on. And by doing these things, they were able to push the peak and decline in world industrial output out a decade or two or three into the future, but the same fundamental result kept coming up in any case. I'm going to suggest that that 1972 study really was pretty much on track, and we are in fact on track to realizing those results. Something they didn't look at in that study was the interaction of the financial economy with the sort of physical economy. My thesis is that these three factors are the main limiting factors that are actually bringing growth to a close in real time. I'll go through each of them very briefly. In the early 20th century, having all of this cheap, abundant, highly concentrated energy at our disposal, it enabled us to make stuff a lot faster than we had been doing, especially with powered assembly lines. So our problem then was one of overproduction. We solved that in a couple of different ways. One was with advertising, talking people into wanting more stuff, but also with consumer credit, making it easier for people to go into debt to buy stuff, pushing consumption forward in time effectively. Consume now, pay later. We also altered the monetary system in a fundamental way. We disentangled money from precious metals so that money and debt were effectively the same thing. When we go to the bank and take out a loan for $10,000, the banker doesn't go in the vault and look around for $10,000 that somebody else left there. No, the money is created with a few computer keystrokes in an instant. And then when the loan is repaid, that money disappears. But of course, there's interest also due on that loan. Where does the interest come from? Well, it's not created when the loan is created, so it has to come from us doing business with other people in the economy, working for them, selling them stuff, whatever. And then as long as the total amount of debt is growing within the economy, then the total amount of money is growing, and therefore, theoretically, everyone's going to be able to pay off their loans with interest. So the necessity for growth has actually been programmed into our financial and monetary system. So debt grows over the course of the 20th century. Up until about 2008, consumer debt leading the way. There's this big inflection point at 2008, and of course that's the big financial crisis. And at that point, the government takes over, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve take over as the borrower and lender of last resort in order to keep the economy from imploding. Remember, if the total amount of debt is not increasing, then the whole thing can come crashing down on itself, which is what almost happened in 2008. But well, I guess my point here is that we've reached fundamental limits to debt. If debt can can continue to grow as long as the economy is growing. But what's happened over the past few decades is that debt has been actually growing faster than GDP. Now, this partly happened as a result of globalization. American workers were, in effect, competing with workers in other countries on the other side of the planet. And so American factory workers' average wages really haven't increased since the early 1970s if adjusted for inflation. So people were wanting to buy more stuff because they were being advertised at all the time, and the economy needed them to buy more stuff because 70% of the economy is consumer spending, and the economy has to grow. So how does this happen? Well, with more debt. And so in virtually every year since 1980, debt has grown faster than GDP. So that's a trap. Once people are into debt beyond up to a certain point, then they can't make payments on their existing debt, and banks don't want to loan them any more money. So what do we do at that point? Again, that's effectively the point we've reached with regard to consumer debt, and now governments are finding their own limits to how much debt they can take on in order to keep this whole pyramid scheme moving along. So, limits to debt, how about energy? Well, remember, energy is what enabled all of this to happen in the first place. Oil, probably the most important source of energy, certainly in terms of measurable quantity, joules or kilowatt hours, or however you want to measure energy. And the U.S. was at the center of the oil industry for many decades. This is where it started. In the early 20th century, the U.S. was by far the world's foremost oil exporting nation. Half the world's oil was coming from oil wells here. So this is the template. This tells us what happens to an oil-producing province. U.S. oil discoveries peaked around 1930, have generally been declining since. It's not that we're not discovering any more oil. Yes, we're finding little pockets of oil in North Dakota and here and there, but compared to what we were finding in the early 30s, it's really just a drip and drabs. And U.S. oil production peaked in 1970s, generally been going downhill ever since. We get a few little bumps along the way, as we did from the North Slope of Alaska, from the Gulf of Mexico. Now we're getting a little bump up from the shale deposits in North Texas and North Dakota. But that's going to be short-lived, and within a few years we'll be back on the downward trend. So again, this is the template, and we're seeing that play out in countries around the world. Most oil-producing countries are seeing declining rates of production, and for the world as a whole, crude oil has not increased since, in terms of rate of flow to market, has not increased since late 2004. So even with very high oil prices and every incentive to bring as much oil to market as possible, the world's oil producers are basically stuck in neutral. And all evidence suggests that sometime within the next few years, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years, something like that, this plateau will end and global oil production will begin its inevitable decline. This is what the oil industry looked like back in the early 1930s. This is what it looks like today, drilling in a mile or 2 or 3 of ocean water. Again, it's not as though we're about to run out of oil. Far from it. There are enormous amounts of low-grade hydrocarbons yet to be extracted, but that's the point. Extraction of non-renewable resources always proceeds according to the low-hanging fruit principle. So we've extracted the cheap, easy stuff, and what's left is going to be hard, expensive, and slow. So that's why oil producers need a high price these days in order to justify going out and looking for new oil. And the price they need in order to justify doing that is getting perilously close to the price that kills the economy. I don't have this slide here because I wanted to make this as brief as possible, but economic analysis has shown every time we've had an oil price spike in the last 40 years, we've had a recession immediately following. And that's kind of what's happening right now with oil prices above $100 now for months on end. Many economists are looking at the situation and saying, well, look, if the oil price stays here or goes even higher, that's it. We're going to be back in recession. So limits to energy, that's obviously a bigger subject than I can cover in 5 minutes. If there are questions or discussion, I'd be happy to go into more detail, but I would argue that we are reaching fundamental limits to our ability to grow our global energy supply. How about the environment? Well, we're seeing weird weather, and weird weather costs. It's not just an inconvenience, it's not just a human catastrophe, it's also an economic catastrophe. And not only weird weather, but also worsening industrial accidents. This should be no surprise. If we're having to drill deeper in more inaccessible places, it stands to reason more accidents will happen and they'll cost more to clean up when they do happen. And that's exactly what we're seeing. 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, the total bill for weird weather and industrial accidents was about $250 billion, according to the insurance industry. And this is important because these costs, again, are real costs that drag on the economy. So $250 billion in 2010, well in 2011, last year we passed that $250 billion mark by June. So this is an exponential rate of increase in direct monetary costs from environmental problems. You don't have to extrapolate those out very far to get to a point where there's basically no room for more economic growth. So there's my case. Obviously, what should we do about that if it's true? And maybe I'm wrong by 5 or 10 years. Does that really make that much difference? What we should do about it, presumably, is what we'll be talking about for the next 2 days. But I just say I think it's really important that we develop local resilience in our communities because we have shocks on the way, inevitably at this point, no matter what we do. And resilience is in many ways opposed to what we thought of as economic efficiency. We have made our economy as efficient as possible, but in the process, we've wrung out a lot of the resilience that it previously had. We need to move back in the other direction. There's a lot that's not at peak. We may be at peak oil, but we're not at peak cooperation or peak happiness. And we can have a much more satisfying way of life without having more consumption of energy or anything else. And that's something we need to focus on, and I know we will be focusing on over the course of our conversations together. So that's just hopefully a few opening and framing thoughts that may help us. And I know they may be controversial thoughts, and I'm certainly open to that discussion. So thank you.